What would you do if your HOA decided that your driveway was now community property? That's exactly what happened to me. I had lived in my house for over 30 years, a quiet little place in a neighborhood that, for the most part, kept to itself. I spent my days tinkering with classic cars in my garage, enjoying my retirement in peace. That was until Karen showed up. Karen wasn't just any neighbor, she was the new self-appointed queen of the HOA, a compliance officer who took her job far too seriously. Before she arrived, the HOA had been a minor inconvenience at worst, enforcing basic rules like keeping lawns trimmed and trash bins stored properly. But Karen? She turned it into her personal kingdom. Citations started flying for things no one had ever cared about: mailbox colors, the number of wind chimes on porches, the unauthorized shade of mulch in flower beds. It wasn't about keeping the neighborhood nice. It was about power. I had heard stories about her before I ever had to deal with her directly. Some neighbors whispered about absurd fines, others just shook their heads and avoided conflict. But the day I stepped outside with my morning coffee and found Karen's gleaming SUV parked diagonally across my driveway, blocking me in, I realized I was her next target. At first, I knocked politely on her door. She lived 2 houses down and answered with an expression of exaggerated confusion. "Oh, your driveway? I thought that space was common area," she said, tilting her head as if she truly didn't understand the concept of private property. When I pointed out that the curb cut was clearly mine, she sighed dramatically. "Well, I'm heading out soon anyway. We all need to be flexible, you know. The HOA expects cooperation." I should have known then that this wasn't the last time I'd have to deal with her. And I had no idea just how far she would go. I tried to brush it off. It was just one incident, right? Maybe Karen was just clueless, maybe she really did think my driveway was some kind of shared space. But then it happened again. And again. The next time, I came back from the grocery store only to find her SUV wedged halfway into my driveway as she stood on the sidewalk, deep in conversation with another neighbor. I idled for a moment, expecting her to notice and move. She didn't. When I finally gave a short honk, she turned, shot me a glare like I was some kind of nuisance, and then waved me off dismissively. Like I was the one in the wrong. I waited 5 long minutes while my ice cream melted in the trunk before she finally strolled over, slid into her car, and pulled away without so much as an apology. I confronted her the next morning. I didn't yell, didn't even raise my voice, I just handed her a printed copy of the local ordinance that clearly stated it was illegal to block a driveway. She took it, glanced at it, then smirked. "Don't lecture me about the law," she snapped. "I represent the HOA. We determine how this neighborhood functions. If you have a problem, take it up with the board." She turned to leave but then added with a little smirk, "Besides, maybe if you let me park here sometimes, you'd get fewer complaints about that squeaky old truck in your garage." That was when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a power play. A test to see how far she could push me. That night, I ranted to Mike, my friend who lived a few streets over. He'd had his own run-ins with Karen, she'd fined him over his mulch color, forced his wife to repaint their flower bed, even threatened to cite him for having an unapproved shade of patio furniture. "She's power drunk," Mike said, shaking his head. "You need to do something before she really digs in." I thought about filing another complaint with the HOA, but I already knew how that would go. Karen controlled the meetings, and the other board members were either too passive or too scared to push back. I needed something bigger. Something she couldn't ignore. And then it hit me. A ridiculous, absurd, absolutely insane idea. For years, I had dreamed of restoring a military vehicle. Not for war, not for showboating, just as a bucket list project. I had spent decades working in construction, saving up money, and keeping my hands busy with cars and motorcycles. But I had never found a good reason to go through with it. Until now. If Karen wanted to play a game of who could control my driveway, I'd show her just how bad an idea that was. I spent the next several nights deep in research, scrolling through military surplus auctions, online forums, and legal guidelines. To my surprise, it wasn't even that difficult to purchase a decommissioned armored vehicle. In fact, in some states, you could even register them as historic vehicles, fully street legal, provided they had their weapons removed. It didn't take long before I found the perfect machine, a British FV-432 APC, an armored personnel carrier. Not a full-blown battle tank with a turret, but a 15-ton steel behemoth on tracks, more than enough to send a message. I showed the listing to Mike, who stared at it in disbelief before bursting into laughter. "You're serious," he said. "You're actually gonna do this?" "Damn right, I am," I said. "Frank, this is nuclear retaliation. This is like bringing a battleship to a neighborhood pool party." I just shrugged. "She wants to block my driveway? Let's see her try when I've got 40,000 pounds of British steel sitting there." Mike let out a long whistle, then clapped me on the back. "I gotta admit, I'm impressed. Let me know if you need help with the shipping. And for the record, I can't wait to see Karen's face when that thing rolls in." The auction ended 2 days later, and I won the bid. The hardest part wasn't buying the APC, it was keeping my excitement in check while I waited for it to arrive. Because I wasn't just getting back at Karen. I was about to make neighborhood history. The day my armored personnel carrier arrived, the entire neighborhood stopped. It was just before noon when the rumble of a massive flatbed truck echoed down the street. I had been pacing my porch all morning, heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. Even knowing this was completely legal, I wasn't sure how the neighbors would react. I wasn't even sure how I would react when I saw the thing in person. But the moment that 15-ton hulk of British engineering came rolling down the road, I knew I had made the right call. The flatbed pulled up in front of my house, and the driver climbed out, shaking his head with an amused grin. "I've delivered some crazy things, but this one takes the cake," he said, adjusting his cap. "Appreciate it," I said, already feeling the buzz of adrenaline as I moved toward the truck. A few neighbors had peeked out their windows. One man walking his dog had stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth slightly open. A teenager on a bike pulled out his phone, recording. And then there was Karen. She emerged from her house the moment the APC was unloaded onto the street, her face shifting from confusion to horror to a shade of red I didn't know was humanly possible. She stormed down the sidewalk, her heels clicking like gunfire against the pavement. "What is that?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the armored vehicle now rumbling under its own power as the driver helped me ease it onto my driveway. I hopped off, folded my arms, and grinned. "It's my new vehicle." Karen's eyes bulged. "That's not a vehicle. That's a military monstrosity. You can't park that here." "Sure I can," I said, keeping my tone deliberately casual. Nothing in the HOA rules about historic military vehicles. It's legally registered, not blocking the sidewalk, and sitting neatly in my driveway. Same as any other car. She gaped at me, her hands balling into fists. "This is a safety hazard. This is a violation of community standards. This is completely unacceptable." I shrugged. "You parked your SUV in my driveway whenever you wanted. Seemed fair to get something big enough to make sure that doesn't happen anymore." By now, more neighbors had come outside. Some were whispering to each other, some were just standing in stunned silence. Mike was grinning like a lunatic, practically vibrating with suppressed laughter. A couple of kids from down the street had run over, staring at the APC with wide, amazed eyes. Karen spun around, clearly expecting backup from the crowd. But no one spoke up in her favor. No one stepped forward to say anything. If anything, I saw a few smirks, a couple of knowing nods. People were tired of her nonsense. Her lips thinned. "This is an emergency. I'm calling a special HOA meeting immediately. This will not stand." I gave her my most polite smile. Looking forward to it. Karen turned on her heel and stomped back toward her house, nearly tripping on the curb in her fury. Mike burst into laughter the moment she was out of earshot. "Dude, you broke her." I think her brain just short-circuited. I turned to admire my new acquisition. The British FV432 sat like a monument in my driveway, its dark green plating catching the afternoon sun, its heavy tracks resting firmly on my property like a steel-clad middle finger to every parking ticket Karen had ever written. I wasn't an idiot. I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to take a loss gracefully. She would fight this, and she'd fight dirty. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. And I was damn well going to enjoy it. Karen didn't just take the loss badly, she took it as a personal declaration of war. The day after the APC landed in my driveway, I woke up to find a violation notice taped to my front door. Bold red letters stamped across the top read, "Immediate compliance required." I snorted, already knowing who it was from before I even opened it. Sure enough, at the bottom, Karen's signature was scrawled out in her usual aggressive strokes. The notice listed a handful of supposed violations: excessive yard clutter, non-conforming vehicle, community aesthetic disruption. The best one? Unsafe structure causing distress to neighbors. Structure? It was a vehicle, not a damn treehouse. I snapped a photo of it and sent it to Mike. A few seconds later, he texted back. "She's unraveling." Yeah, no kidding. At this point, I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She wanted to drown me in HOA bureaucracy, hoping I'd get so frustrated that I'd cave. Unfortunately for her, I had time. And patience. And the full legal documentation that proved I was in the clear. But Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. 2 days later, a city zoning officer showed up at my house, clipboard in hand, looking mildly uncomfortable. "Sir, we've received several complaints about illegal commercial activity on this property," he said. "Something about an unauthorized auto repair business?" I stared at him. "A what?" He checked his notes. "Reports say multiple vehicles have been seen here undergoing modifications, that there are tools and industrial equipment being stored outside, and that there's an unsafe military vehicle on site posing a danger to the public." I almost laughed. "Let me guess. All these complaints came from one person?" The officer hesitated. "We can't disclose that, sir, but..." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Off the record?" "Yeah. It's pretty obvious." I folded my arms. "Look, I work on my classic cars in my garage for fun. That's a hobby, not a business. The APC is legally registered. I have all the paperwork to prove it." He nodded. "I figured. But when we get enough complaints, we have to check them out. Just do me a favor and keep your records in order. If this keeps happening, you might need to challenge it legally." I thanked him, watched him leave, then turned toward Karen's house. Her curtains shifted as she peeked out, watching. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. That night, Mike came over with a six-pack and some news. "You're gonna love this," he said, dropping onto my porch chair. "Remember how I told you she was full of it? Well, guess what I found?" He pulled up an email thread from an old HOA archive. Karen had an exemption. A personal exemption. While she was fining neighbors for everything from the color of their mulch to how tall their bushes were, Karen's own house had been quietly excluded from multiple HOA regulations. She made herself immune to the rules, Mike said, shaking his head. So while she's out here handing out fines for people's patios being 2 inches out of compliance, she's got an unapproved fence, non-HOA compliant solar panels, and, get this, a backyard shed that's technically too large. I let out a low whistle. So she's been running this whole HOA like a dictatorship while making sure none of the rules apply to her? Exactly. I leaned back, considering my options. I could bring this up at the next meeting, let the whole neighborhood see what a hypocrite she was. But I had a feeling Karen wouldn't go down quietly. And I was right. The next morning, just as I was finishing my coffee, a tow truck pulled up in front of my house. A tow truck. I walked outside just as a man in a neon vest climbed out. He held a clipboard and gave me a professional nod. "Sir, we're here to remove the unauthorized military vehicle from the property." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? And who exactly authorized that?" He handed me a document with an official-looking HOA letterhead. But the second I read the fine print, I felt my blood pressure spike. The whole thing was fake. It was signed only by Karen and claimed the HOA had the authority to remove hazardous structures without notice. I smiled coldly. "This isn't real." The guy frowned. "It's got a signature. Not a valid one." I pulled out my phone and dialed Mr. Benson, the HOA chairman. The moment he picked up, I put the call on speaker. "Hey, Rick, did the board approve the removal of my legally registered vehicle?" A confused pause. Then, "What? No. Why would we?" "Just checking. Because I've got a tow truck here with an illegal order signed by Karen." Silence. Then a very, very annoyed sigh. "I'll handle it. Tell them to stand down." I turned to the tow truck driver. "You heard the man." The guy glanced at me, then at his clipboard, then at the APC sitting peacefully in my driveway. "Well, that's a first." He climbed back into his truck. Karen came storming out just as the truck pulled away. "What are you doing? That thing is a menace. It needs to be removed." I tucked the fake document into my pocket and met her glare with a smirk. "Nice try, Karen." She clenched her jaw so tight I thought she might crack a tooth. It was official now. She had gone rogue. And the best part? She was sloppy. All her desperation, all her underhanded tactics, there were witnesses now. People were talking. This wasn't just my battle anymore. The neighborhood was watching. And Karen had just made a very big mistake. Karen had made a fatal mistake. She overplayed her hand. Her desperate attempts to get rid of the APC had backfired spectacularly, and now the entire neighborhood was paying attention. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now murmuring about her hypocrisy, her misuse of HOA funds, and her ridiculous abuse of power. The whispering turned into full-blown conversations, and by the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, Karen wasn't the one calling the shots anymore. The community center was packed that evening. Karen, standing stiffly at the front, clutched a thick folder of papers like a shield. She opened with her usual dramatic speech, claiming my APC was a violation of neighborhood harmony and a clear disruption of property values. But before she could finish, Mike stood up and held up the documents exposing her personal HOA exemptions. "Karen, can you explain why you've been fining people for non-compliant fences when yours isn't even HOA approved?" he asked loudly. A few heads turned, nodding. "And while we're at it," another neighbor chimed in, "how about the thousands of dollars in HOA funds that went toward landscaping upgrades on your property?" Karen's face turned pale. She started flipping through her folder as if she could magically make the evidence disappear. That's not relevant," she stammered. "It's completely relevant," Mr. Benson said, rubbing his temples. He turned to the room. "I'm calling for a vote to remove Karen from her position as compliance officer." The vote wasn't even close. The moment the results were read, Karen stormed out, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. That was the last time she ever held any power over the neighborhood. Within a month, she resigned from the HOA entirely, citing health reasons and claiming the stress had become unbearable. No one bought it. Without Karen breathing down everyone's necks, the neighborhood finally relaxed. HOA meetings became civil again. The ridiculous fines stopped. I even got invited to drive my APC in the town's 4th of July parade, which was easily the most fun I'd had in years. And as for my driveway? Not once, not a single time after that meeting, did I ever find an SUV blocking it again. So tell me, have you ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA officer like Karen? How did you fight back? Share your stories below, let's see who had it worse.